Hello. So today we're going to be taking a look at the cruise and the descent phases of flight. So we're going to be talking about a few things during the cruise, but the main thing that we're going to cover is talking about the arrival and planning for the arrival towards our arrival airport. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just jump back into the cockpit where it's a bit quieter, and hopefully you guys can hear me okay there. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually going to be a couple of little things that you can do during the cruise phase of flight. The first thing that you need to do is, of course, if you're flying with air traffic control, listen out for air traffic control instructions. As your flight progresses, you'll be handed off between different controllers who are controlling different areas of airspace. So just keep an ear out for that, and just be ready to retune your radios as necessary. The next thing is something I mentioned in the previous video, and that's about getting into the habit of setting your heading indicator to match your current heading. Now I explained that it's a good habit to get into, but I didn't explain why that's a good habit to get into. Now at the moment the aircraft is flying using LNAV, so what's basically happening is LNAV is controlling the direction of the aircraft. Now if we needed to change direction for any reason, we would go on to heading select. However, if the heading didn't match the direction we were currently flying in, then the aircraft would turn off in a random direction. Now you can see where the heading is, one by the number that's up here on the MCP, and two, you've got this pink bug here. So if I had the heading set to something completely different and then enabled heading select, you can see that the aircraft turns off in a direction that I didn't want it to. So what I'm going to do is put it back onto LNAV and get the aircraft to get back onto our planned flight path there. So what you want to do, so that's the reason why you want to make sure that the heading matches your sort of current direction there, so that when you do move on to heading select, that the aircraft doesn't make a sudden turn like that. Now one other thing to note, the nav display here normally works in track mode, so what it's doing is it's following this solid white line here. Now let me just move the heading selector out of the way so I can demonstrate something here. There we go. So at the moment we're following a track of 334 degrees. However, you can see we've got this little white triangle here. Now the white triangle actually represents where the nose of the aircraft is pointing, so when you match up the heading selector there, you want to match it up to that triangle and not the white line. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do that just now. Mouse is being a bit tricky here with the heading select. So I'm going to match the little pink bug there. So the actual heading should be 331. Our actual track over the ground is 333. So now if I select heading select, you can see that the aircraft barely turned at all, because it's already pretty much pointing in the right direction there. Now sometimes you won't be able to get this perfect, but as long as you get it close enough, then it will prevent that kind of sharp turn there. Now one last thing, which may be quite common, if you're on a longer flight, you will of course have fuel in your centre fuel tank, and what will generally happen during the cruise phase of flight is that the centre tank will run out of fuel. What will happen is you will get a master caution light, and you'll also get a fuel annunciator showing up. So how do you resolve that problem? Well, very simply, if you have a look at this extra video that's on the screen just now, all you need to do is just go up to the overhead panel on the fuel control panel and just turn off the center fuel pumps. And what that will do is that will clear the master caution lights and the fuel annunciator there, and you can just continue flying as normally. Okay, so now that I've covered all of those little extra bits and pieces, now let's get into the meat of this video, which is going to be planning for our arrival at our arrival airports. So if we have a look at the CDU just now, you can see that we've got it on the legs page there, and you can see the various legs and distance information, speed information and altitude information there. Now if you want to know how long it's going to take to get to where we're going, we can click on this little progress button here to bring up the progress page. Now what we can see on here are a few bits of information related to when we're due to arrive at each waypoint. And what we're looking for is this line here, which says EGPE 13:26 Zulu. So if we have a look at the current time is 12:41. So we should be arriving at Inverness in about 40 minutes time, maybe 45 minutes time there. The line below that says 2T/D, so that shows 2 top of descent. And you can see that we're due to arrive at our top of the descent at 1300 Zulu time and at a distance of 114 nautical miles. So in about 20 minutes time, and we can actually see it popping up just now on the nav display there. There's our top of descent. So what you want to do is you want to plan for your arrival is, within maybe 10-15 minutes before you reach the top of descent. Now the top of descent will change because you're going to be adding to the flight plan. You're going to be adding a bit more distance, so the top of descent will change. However, you want to be planning for your arrival between 10 and 20 minutes before you reach your initial top of descent there. So what I like to do is I like to work in reverse order when I'm planning for my arrival. So I like to look at the like a map of the airport first, try and figure out where I'm going to end up, like where I'm actually going to end up parking once I arrive at the airport, and then I'll work back from there. So I'm going to figure out, okay, well, which runway am I most likely to land on, and then what's going to be the taxi route from the runway to my parking spots. Once I know which runway I'm going to be landing on, I'm going to be looking to find ILS information for that runway. Once I've found ILS information for that runway, then I'm going to be looking at star charts or standard terminal arrival routes to figure out how am I going to get from my initial descent down to our final approach, where we're going to be lined up with the runway at a low altitude and conducting our final approach to land. So what I'm going to do just now is I'm going to cut away from this cockpit view here, and we're going to start looking through some aviation charts and grabbing some information that we'll need to dial into the CDU and some more information that we'll need for our approach phases of the flight. Okay, so what I'm going to do to find some charts for Inverness Airport, I'm just going to use the same technique that I used to find charts for our departure airport, and that's by using Google. So what I'm going to do is just type in the ICAO code for Inverness, which was Echo Golf Papa Echo, followed by the word charts. Do a search there, and we get a few results. Have a look here. Now, the first chart that I want to look at is just a general airport chart, just to kind of get an idea of the layout of the airport, get an idea of where all the runways are, where all the main terminals are, and things like that. So I'm just going to click on aerodrome chart there. We'll spin this around, and here we have a map of Inverness Airport. So me being from Inverness, I already know the airport. I've flown here many times. If you've watched any of my other tutorials, you would have seen, I fly here all the time. So the main runway here is, well, Inverness has got 2 runways, but it's got one main runway here, which is 05 and 23. Now, our flight plan said that we were going to be landing on runway 25. Now, the reason that we leave planning our arrival till later on in the flight is because the conditions at our arrival airport might have changed. That's why we don't do it before the flight. For example, the weather conditions might have changed at the arrival airport, or some sort of events might have happened at the arrival airport, which means that our planned runway may no longer be available to use, and we might have to use a different runway, for example. So some of the information that we can grab from the airport chart are just some of the radio frequencies. Now, of course, I'm not using air traffic control in this video, but if you are using air traffic control, usually you'll find a lot of the various frequencies that you'll need. For example, up here on this one, we've got an ATIS frequency, we've got a tower frequency. Bigger airports will also have a separate ground frequency as well, and things like that. So if you are using air traffic control, you can grab all of those frequencies, and it saves you having to scramble and try and find them later on in the flight after you land, for example. The other useful bit of information you can find, or normally find on a chart like this, is the airport's elevation. And if we have a look at the top here, it says AD elevation 31 feet. So we need the elevation because we are going to double check the pressurization system and just make sure that the landing altitude on that is set correctly. So it's also good just to make a quick note of the aerodrome elevation there. Okay, so at this point, now it would usually be quite good to go and get an ATIS report for the airport that you're arriving at. ATIS reports, of course, giving you an up-to-date kind of weather reports or of the weather conditions at the airport. The main things that you're going to be looking out for on that are going to be the wind direction, and usually ATIS reports will also tell you which runways are active as well, so that gives you a good idea of which runway you're going to be landing on. Now, because I'm using the fair weather preset, I know for a fact that runway 05 is going to be okay. The winds are going to be perfectly calm at ground level, so we're going to stick with using runway 05 here. Also in FSX, Inverness Airport doesn't actually have an ATIS frequency, even though it does in real life. It doesn't in the Sims, so that's another reason why I'm not going to be using it. So let's commit to it now. Let's say that we're going to be landing on runway 05. So what we can do next is go and look for an ILS chart, which gives us more detailed information about conducting an ILS approach for runway 05. So if we have a look at the chart index again, what we're looking for is we're looking for an instrument approach chart for an ILS on runway 05, and the Boeing 737 is a category C aircraft, so we'll choose this chart here. Now, what you can see on your screen just now is a final approach chart for runway 05 at Inverness. Now, if you're not sure how to read charts like this, then what I'd recommend that you do is click up in the top right corner, because I've already covered how to read charts like this in its own tutorial video. So if you don't know how to read this, then I'd recommend you go and check that out so you can understand what you're actually looking at on this screen here. For this video, what I'm going to be doing is just picking out the key bits of information that we need to perform the landing in the 737. So the first bit of information that we can grab will be the transition altitude. So if we have a look up in the top right corner here, you can see that it gives us the transition altitude of 3,000 feet for Inverness Airport. So the transition altitude is the altitude where we will switch from using standard barometric pressure back down to using local barometric pressure. Now, because I'm using the fair weather preset, I'm not going to need to change the pressure at all, but I will still change it from the standard setting. I'll change it back to 1013 millibars. Next, we need to grab some information about the ILS itself. So if we have a look at this text box, this information box here, this is the one that we need to grab information about the ILS. So you can see that we have our 3-letter ILS identifier, which will be ILN, and just next to that we've got the frequency 108.50, so make a note of both of those. The last thing we need for the ILS will be the localizer course, or the actual specific runway heading. So if we just follow the localizer line out here to the southwest, you can see here that it gives us our course here of 054 degrees. So that'll be the ILS course. We also need to make a note of that. Okay, so once you've got those little bits of information, now we need to have a look at the vertical guidance chart so we can identify what altitude we're going to be intercepting the ILS at. So if we have a look here, now we're not going to be following this specific procedure, because what we need to do here is actually fly over the VOR, fly out on a radial of 254, loop back and join the ILS. Now we're not going to be doing that because we're approaching from the south. What we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be approaching from the south and then following a sort of slight DME arc to get or to join the localizer, and then we're going to turn. But I'm going to show you that in the on the next chart there. However, we still need the altitude at which we're going to be intercepting the glide slope. So if we follow the vertical guidance here, you can see that we're going to be descending down to an altitude of 2,700 feet. And then you can see we level off, and then we come back, and then we're going to be joining the glide slope at a distance of 8.3 nautical miles at an altitude of 2,700 feet. So just make a note of that there. Now, the reason I need this altitude is because I'm not flying with air traffic control. I'm going to be flying an approach using charts and kind of setting the approach up using the charts that are available. If you're flying with air traffic control would most likely give you vectors to approach the runway. So for example, they'll give you specific headings and altitudes to fly to get you down into this general area where you can intercept the localizer and then perform the ILS approach from there. As I said, because I'm doing it all kind of automatically using charts, that's one of the main reasons why I'm just grabbing this altitude here. Now, another bit of information we can grab from the vertical guidance here is going to be the go around altitude, or the missed approach altitude. So you can see here, if we were descending towards a runway and then we decided we couldn't make a safe landing and we had to kind of pull back up into the sky again, you can see we've got the dotted line there. So we've actually got this little text box which gives us direction of, or gives us instructions on what to do. So you can see that we need to fly a maximum of 210 knots. And it says here, climb straight ahead to 2,000 feet, then a climbing turn right to the Inverness VOR at 3,000 feet. So our go around altitude, or missed approach altitude, will be 3,000 feet. And the last bit of information we need are the minimums, because we need a minimum height to decide whether it's safe to land or not. So if we come down to the bottom left corner here, you can see we've got a little kind of charts box thing here, which gives us our minimums. So aircraft category is category C, the ILS approach category is a category 1 approach, and our minimums are going to be 209 feet, or alternatively we could use 179 feet on our radio altimeter for the minimums there. So just make a note of those numbers, and then we can now look at our final chart, which would normally be a star chart. However, because Inverness doesn't have any stars, then what I'm going to be using is something called a direct arrival chart. So back on the index again, what we're looking for now is an instrument approach chart, direct arrival for an ILS runway 05, and again it's a category C aircraft that we're going to be flying. So we'll load up this chart here. Now, as I said before, if you're flying at a larger airport, you should be looking for a star chart, or a standard terminal arrival route. Now, for the purposes of this video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about the arrival I'm going to be using very quickly, but I will talk about star charts and how to read star charts in a couple of minutes. But for this video, let me just explain what I'm going to be doing for this arrival in this video. So what you can see on the screen just now is Inverness Airport up here, and you can see that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be approaching from the south. And then if I zoom in, that would help quite a bit as well. So we're going to be approaching from the south on the Inverness, on a radial of 192 there. So we're going to be flying up to this waypoint here. Then you can see that we're going to be making a left-hand turn, and then we're going to be following almost a slight DME arc approach here. You can see that we're going to be flying until we reach the Inverness radial 214, so that's going to be a waypoint there. We need to be above 4,000 feet at that point. And then we're going to be continually descending along here until we reach the Inverness radial of 226, and then you can see that we're going to be making a right hand turn over the top end of Loch Ness there onto a course of 054 to join ILN at a distance of 8.3, so that's the Inverness ILS there, and at that point at a distance of 8.3 nautical miles, that's where we're going to be intercepting the glide slope and conducting our final approach to land at Inverness Airport up here. Now, what this chart doesn't give us is like some specific information about the waypoint, so we can actually find out what we're doing up here using this text box. You can see at the bottom here it says route via Gussie, the Inverness VOR on a radial of 192. So the Gussie waypoint is on a radial of 192 from the Inverness VOR at a distance of 20 nautical miles. So it's actually not on the chart here, but you've got Inverness radial 192, distance of 14 nautical miles. That's where we begin the turn. So the Gussie waypoint will be about down here somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to fly to Gussie and then follow this radial into this waypoint, and then we're going to turn left and then turn right to join the approach there. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about stars very quickly because this is what you'll be using more commonly. So what you can see on your screen just now is the index for Gatwick Airport. So let's imagine that we're now flying back to Gatwick. How do we figure out what the approach would be? So what I'm going to do is, don't worry, there's a lot of charts as you can see. So what I'm going to do is we're going to try and find the one that we want here. So we've got standard arrival chart, instrument, bracket star, and then we're just going to take a quick look at this Willow 3B. It's got nothing to do with this flight that we're flying just now, but I just want to try and briefly explain how to read the star charts. So Gatwick Airport is actually just up here, and you can see that we've got sort of 3 routes here which take us to this Holly holding pattern here, or this waypoint, and then from here we would normally fly up to the airport to join a final approach up here. So what we've got here is the Willow 3B, Willow 1F and Willow 2H. Now why do we have, these are essentially 3 star arrivals in one. So basically what we've got is we've got the star here, which is going to be taking air traffic which is approaching from the north or from the west, and what the aircraft are going to, the routes that any aircraft are going to be following is they're going to either be joining this Kidley waypoint and then flying down to Midhurst and flying into Holly from there. They're either going to join Kennet and then fly into Midhurst and Holly from there, or they're going to be joining Beddick and then follow to Nigget, Midhurst and then Holly from there. So the point that I want to make with this is that the Willow is the name of the star. So the Willow is this whole shape of the approach. But what you might get with a star is something called a transition. Now, the transition is the specific route that you're going to be following. So you might be told to follow the Willow, the Willow star, and then depending on which direction you're approaching from, you might be following the Willow star using the Kidley transition, which means you'll be flying into this Kidley waypoint and then flying in from here. Alternatively, you might have the Kennet transition or the Beddick transition. So that's kind of the difference between the star and a transition. The star is the actual main route, and the transition is the specific waypoints that you're going to be passing through to use that route. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now that we've got that information, let's look at how we add it to the flight plan. So what I'm going to do is just bring up the CDU there and zoom in on the nav display just so we can see what's going on. So to start entering the route, what we need to do is go into the departures and arrivals page. Here we've got Inverness, EGPE, and we want to select the button next to arrival here to select the arrival information. So what I'm going to do here is something similar to what I did for the departure. The first thing I'm going to do is select the actual approach that I want. So it's going to be an ILS for 05 here, but you can see that we've got VOR DME approaches for runway 05 and runway 23. We've also got some RNAV approaches there as well, but it's the ILS for runway 05 that we want, so I'm going to select that there. Now if Inverness, or if the airport has stars available, that will then filter the list of stars available. Here you can see it clearly says there's none available for Inverness, so we're not going to worry about that. However, what we do have on the right hand side underneath the approach now are a list of transitions. So you can see that Inverness has 3 transitions from 3 different waypoints. The one we want is using the Gussie waypoint here, and if you remember back to the chart there, the initial turn that we were going to make was at a distance of 14 nautical miles there, so that's why this one is, rather than having the full waypoint name, it has Gussie and then 14 there representing 14 nautical miles. So that's the transition that we want, that's the specific route to get onto our final approach that we want. So I'm just going to tap the button next to that. Now that hasn't actually set the route into the CDU yet. What the CDU is currently doing is actually modifying the route. If you have a look at the nav display here, you may have noticed that the line changed. So what we've got now is, rather than having the solid pink line, we've now got a dotted white line laid on top of the solid white line. And you'll also notice that the execute light came on as well. So what we can do is we can review the changes that we've made before we actually execute them and tell the flight computer, yes, this is definitely what we want to do. So if you go into the legs page, first you'll see at the top here we've got mods. So this shows that we're currently modifying the routes, and you'll notice that that's highlighted, and you'll also notice there that we've got a couple of waypoints also highlighted. So these are the modifications that we're making to the routes. So if we go into the next page, you'll see that we've got more waypoints going to be added in, and then more, and so on and so forth. So we can actually have a look at the nav display here to have a look at those changes and get a visual representation of what they look like and what the route looks like. So if we come up to the ethos control panel here, what we can do is move the map into its plan mode there, and that gives us a top-down view of the different waypoints. Also, what I'm going to do is just zoom in a little bit, because once we take a look at the approach near the airport, all of the waypoints are going to be quite crammed together, so by zooming in it just gives us a better view of all of the waypoints which are close together. Now at the moment we're currently looking at the TLA waypoint where our top of descent is as well. So how do we look at the next waypoints? Very simply, we just hit this button next to step, and what that will do is that will step forward through each waypoint of the modified route. So if you have a look here, we're currently looking at TLA, which is at the top here. If I hit the step button, that's going to skip forwards to the Findle waypoint, like so. Now you'll notice that we have a blank waypoint here. Let's not worry about that just now, I'll come back to that in a minute. If we step forward again, we should go to the Gussie waypoint there, and you can see that we have that white dotted line. Now if I maybe just dial the range down again just so it's a bit clearer, step forward, you can see that we have that radial 192. So there's that radial there, and you can see that we're making a left hand turn. If I step forward to the next one, we've got another radial, or another waypoint on the radial of 203 from the Inverness VOR. Step forward again, radial of 214, radial of 220, and you can see here we should be beginning our turn at a radial of 220 there. Keep stepping forward, got another waypoint there, and then we've got the intercept, or the localizer intercept here, and then you can see we've got this other dotted white line which is a straight line which represents the runway's localizer there. So if we step forward, then that brings us into Inverness Airport there, and then you can see that we've also got a few additional waypoint and steps for the holding pattern if we have to perform a go around. So the route there all looks okay. That all, like the shape of the route visually looks like what we had on the chart there. So I'm happy that that's the route that we want to use. So what we can do now is we can now execute that just by hitting the execute button there. And you'll notice that as I did that, all of the highlights disappeared. It now says actual route at the top there instead of modified route, and you can see on the nav display that the route turned back into its kind of pink line rather than having that white dotted line. Now let's come back to this little problem that we have here, which is this kind of this gap in the route here. If I dial up the range again, you can see if currently looking at the Tala waypoint, if I step forward to Findle, you can see that the route disappears, and there's actually a gap between Findle and the Gussie waypoint. So how do we get rid of that? Very simply, all we need to do is just tap the button next to the end of the gap there. So Gussie, we'll just type that there, and you see that it copies that into the scratch pad, and then all we do is just tap on the button next to the blank waypoint there. Now you see that it modifies the route again, and you can see that it highlights Gussie, but if we have a look at the nav display, if we zoom in there, you can see it's now giving us that white dotted line in between Findle and Gussie. So basically what we want to do is just connect up these two waypoints. That's what I want to do. I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to execute that change there, and you can now see that we've now got a solid line between the two waypoints, and the legs page looks happy. There's no blank waypoints in there at all. So that's all looking good. We're all set up for the arrival now. The CDU is set up for the arrival, so everything's looking good there. Now what is also worth doing is checking the various speed and altitude constraints here. You want to make sure that the aircraft is going to respect all of the speed and altitude constraints along the star or during the arrival procedure as well. So if you need to, you can go in and change those. Let's have a look here and see if I can show. So if you remember during the departure, I said that we've got the altitude here. So we've got 4,000 or above. So at that waypoint, we're going to be at 4,000 feet or above. If we had 4,000 and then a B, that would be 4,000 and below. If we just have the number there, then that would be the exact number. And if you want to adjust the speed, let me do, I'm not going to do it in this video, but let me just kind of explain how you would adjust things there. So say for example for this D214N, let's say that we wanted to be at a speed of 210 knots at 4,000 feet or above. What we would do is we would type in 210, so that's 210 knots, / 4,000 and above there. Now what I would do is if I tapped this button next to this waypoint there, that would change the information that's in that, and then it would recalculate everything else around that waypoint. So basically what we're telling the FMC is that at this waypoint we want to be at a speed of 210 knots and we can be at 4,000 feet or above. I believe with the speed you can also apply a letter to the speed as well, so I believe that you can have 210 knots or above at this waypoint, and then if you add in the / as well, then that just confirms that it's the speed that you're trying to adjust, and then alternatively you could also have 210 knots or below, and then just enter that in to change that there. Okay, so once you've changed all of that information, you can come back to your map view there, and yeah, so everything's ready to go. So what I'm going to do is just cut the video here. We're just going to skip ahead until we're maybe a minute or two away from our top of descent, and then we'll start the descent, or we'll initiate the descent, and then we'll talk through the descent procedure. Okay, so here we are, just a couple of minutes away from our top of descent. So what's going to happen is just before we reach our top of descent, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to see a little yellow light here on this FMC button. And what that's going to do is that's going to be showing a little message down here on the CDU, which is going to say reset MCP altitude. So basically what's happening is the flight management computers are asking the pilots for permission to initiate the descent. And we can give that permission by simply rolling down the altitude here on the MCP panel. So what I'm going to do for this video is roll the altitude down to our glide slope intercept altitude, which was going to be 2,700 feet. Now if you're flying with air traffic control, what they may do is they may tell you to descend to a particular altitude. If that's the case, then what you want to do is roll the altitude down to that altitude that you've been given, and then hit the level change button here, and then what that will do is that will initiate the descent down to that altitude. Something you need to be aware of when you do that is that the speed window will also become active when you're using the level change mode, so just be ready to manually control the speed at some point if you do end up using that. So here you can see we've got the yellow light there, FMC, and we've got the message on the on the CDU here which says reset MCP altitude. So what I'm going to do is dial the altitude now to 2,700 feet, and you'll notice that as soon as I do, the lights will go out there. So just roll that down, and then when we do actually hit our top of descent, then the aircraft will automatically start descending. Now the rate of descent is going to be controlled by the VNAV profile there. So the VNAV or the flight management system is calculating the ideal rate of descent, and the plane is just going to fly that using the VNAV mode there. So you can notice that we're just turning as we pass over this Tala waypoint there. So I'm just going to keep those good habits up, keep the heading indicator there. Okay, and you can see now that the aircraft, the thrust mode changed there, and you'll notice now that we are now beginning our descent. So what we need to do now is we need to run through the descent procedure, and something important to note is that you need to finish the descent procedure before you reach 10,000 feet above mean sea level. Now that's not a big deal, it's going to take us about maybe 10-15 minutes to reach that altitude, so you don't need to be rushed as you're going through this. So first things first, what we want to do is we want to check the landing altitude on the pressurization panel. So I'm going to come to the overhead panel here. Now if you remember the landing altitude at Inverness Airport, or the Inverness Airport is at an elevation of 31 feet, so we've currently got this set to 50 feet. Now you'll notice that as I roll through the landing altitude selector here, that it moves in 50 feet increments. So what you want to do is just move it to the nearest value there. So you round 31 feet up to 50, that's the closest value we can get, that's fine, we'll leave that as it is. Next we come back to the virtual cockpit view here, and we need to have a look at the annunciator, and you just need to perform another annunciator recall here. So just press on the annunciator, make sure that we don't have any lights stay on. We don't, so we've got no outstanding issues there. Next is to have a look at the CDU descent page. So what I'm going to do is just bring this up here so it's a bit easier to read. Oops, there we go. So to get to the CDU's descent page, there's the descent button here. So just tap on that and I'll bring you to the descent page. Now what we're going to be doing on this page is entering the transition level, but we can't actually do it on this page. So what we need to do is go into the forecast option here, and then you can see we've got transition level there. So the transition altitude at Inverness Airport was going to be 3,000 feet, so that's what I'm going to use. So I'm just going to dial that in there, and then just paste that into the transition level. So the transition level is the level where, or the altitude where we're going to be switching from using the standard barometric pressure back onto using the local barometric pressure. Now, because I'm using the fair weather preset, we're just going to go from standards to 1013. But if you are using a diff, or if you are using real world weather, what you could do now is you could now pre-select the local pressure. Of course, if you went and got the ATIS report earlier, you should have the barometric pressure. So what you can do is you just come up to the EFIS panel up here and just select the local pressure there. You can see that in white we've got it pre-selected there. So when we hit the standard button, if you had like 1010 for example, when you hit the standard button, it will automatically switch to 1010 rather than being the previous value that you had there. So you can pre-select the barometric pressure there. After setting the transition level or the transition altitude, what we can do next is look at the approach ref page, and this is where we're going to be setting in a little bit of performance data for landing. So to get to the approach ref page, what we need to do is click on the init ref button, and that will bring us to the approach ref page. Now if you think back to before the flight, you may have tapped on the init ref button to get to the sort of the performance data for the before takeoff phase of flight. So a little lesson here, or a little kind of bit of trivia about the CDU, is that the init ref page is a sort of a context sensitive page. So depending on the phase of flight that you're flying in, if you press init ref, it will bring up the page most relevant to whichever phase of flight you're in. So on this page, what we're going to do is we're going to select the landing flap setting, and that will also give us our VREF speed, or our landing speed. So you can see here that we've got flaps. We can land with flaps 15 degrees, flaps of 30 degrees, or setting of flaps of 40 degrees. Now because Inverness has a relatively short runway, I'm going to use a full 40 degrees of flaps there. So to select that, what I'm going to do is just press the button next to 40 and 132 knots, and I could either press this button again or tap the button next to flap and speed to enter the flaps and speed there. And what that will do is that will draw a little VREF bug here on the speed tape. Now you'll notice the line underneath there says wind correction of +5 knots. Now I'm not 100% sure under what conditions you add 5 knots. I believe that a lot of people will, I think the VREF speed is your landing speed, but your V approach speed is generally your VREF speed +5 knots. I believe that's where the wind correction comes in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually not add in any wind correction for the landing, because the winds at Inverness Airport will be perfectly calm because I'm using the fair weather preset. That's the reason why I'm not going to use any wind correction there. So I'm going to actually fly the approach at 132 knots there. So now that we've got the VREF speed and the landing flaps calculated, the next thing we can do is set in the minimums. Actually might have made more sense to do this earlier when we changed the barometric pressure, but never mind. So what we can do is we'll set in the minimums now. So the minimums for Inverness Airport we're going to be 209 knots. So I've got the minimum selected here. It's set to barometric, using the barometric minimums rather than using radio altimeter. The radio altimeter is over here on the left side. You just can't see it because of the sort of the structure there. So we'll set the minimums to baro, and we'll dial that up to 209. And if you have a look in the primary flight display, that's where your baro minimums readout is, and you'll also get a green line on the altitude tape just as a visual marker of where the minimums are. Now next what we can do is set up the navigation radials for the ILS landing. So the reason I left the CDU up here is because we've got a little bit of runway information here. So you can see we've got Inverness runway 05, and it gives us some runway length information there. And it also gives us the ILS for 05, so it gives us the frequency 108.50, which matches what we had on the charts, and then also a course of 054 degrees. So that also matches what we had on the chart. Now, first what I'm going to do is set up the nav radials. So what we need to do is we need to set up the nav radials on both the captain's side and the first officer's side. So I'm just going to dial in 108.5 on both just now, and then make it the active frequency there. 108.5. So 108.5 is active on both radials there. And you'll also notice, if you have a look at the primary flight display, we now have some ILS information just here as well. However, the ILS has not been fully set up yet. The next step is to go onto the MCP panel here and set up both the captain's and the first officer's course here. So that's what I'm going to do just now, is just set the course to 054 degrees on both sides. Okay, and that is everything set up for the ILS approach. And you'll also notice, if you have a look at the primary flight display again, we have now the frequency in the course there. Now if you have a look here, if I change the course, it changes the course down here on the primary flight display as well. So that's why you want to make sure the MCP selectors are all correct. And the final step to do during the descent is to set the auto brake. So I'm going to use an auto brake setting of 2 for Inverness Airport. That's a nice balance between a good rate of deceleration and also keeping things comfortable for passengers. You're not going to be throwing passengers forward after you land. Because Inverness has a relatively short runway, we are going to end up using pretty much all of the runway to decelerate, but provided that I make a good touchdown, then we should be okay, provided I don't float it down the runway. Okay, so before I move on, what I'm going to do is just keep those good habits up and just dial down the range as well, now that we're getting a bit closer to Inverness Airport there. So what pilots would do in real life now is they would begin to conduct an approach briefing. So they would start talking about the approach, they would start talking about the routes that they're taking, the star, the setting, the flaps that are going to be used for landing, and the speed, VREF speed and things like that. Because I'm a single pilot simmer, I'm not going to do that, but just be aware that that's something that pilots would do in real life at this point. Okay, so once you've completed all of those steps, now we can run through the descent checklist. So if I have a look at the overhead panel again, the first thing we need to check is the pressurization. So we just want to confirm that the landing altitude is set and it's rounded up or down to the nearest value that we can get there. So that's correct. Next, we want to make sure that we've done the recall. We did. That was pressing the annunciator panel there. We've checked that. That's all good. The third step is to check the auto brake. We've set the auto brake to position 2. That's done. Landing data, we've got our VREF speed there. So if we have a look again, our VREF speed was 132 knots with a flap setting of 40. And we also want to make sure that we've got our minimum set. We have our barometric minimums of 209 feet set in. And then the last thing there is the approach briefing. Again, I said I'm not going to do it because I'm just a single pilot simmer there. Okay, and that is everything for the descent. So before I finish this video, what I want to do is just talk about how you can monitor the descent and make sure that you're on the vertical flight path there. You'll notice on the right side of your nav display we've got RMP, AMP, so again required navigation performance, actual navigation performance, and this little indicator here. So this is like it's very similar to a glide slope indicator. It tells you if you're above the ideal descent path or below the ideal descent path. So if you find that you're below it, then that's not a problem. The aircraft will start to level off a little bit, reduce the rate of descent to catch at that path again. If you find that you're above it, then what you may need to do is extend the spoilers just to help slow the plane down and help the rate of descent there. And we also have a very similar indicator on the primary flight display on the right hand side here as well. Okay, so with that, what I'm going to do is end this video here. So the next few steps that we're going to do are going to take place just as we pass 10,000 feet. And you can see where we're going to be reaching 10,000 feet by these two green dots here. So what's going to happen is the aircraft is going to start slowing down between these two green dots to make sure that we drop below 250 knots. Again, the speed limit below 10,000 feet, but that's something I'll talk about in the next video. So, that's it for this video. So, until next time, thank you all very much for watching. Take care out there, and I will catch you all later.